My brother stood up in that conference room and said, "She doesn't belong here. She never did." I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just sat there with my hands folded on the table, and I let him keep talking. That was the moment I realized everything my grandfather had ever taught me about patience finally made sense. My name is Vivian. I'm 31 years old, and for the better part of a decade, I was the invisible one in my family. Not invisible in the way that gets you sympathy. Invisible in the way that gets you overlooked at holidays, left off email chains, and quietly written out of decisions that were supposed to include everyone. My brother, Spencer, was 4 years older than me and had spent his entire adult life being groomed to take over my grandfather's construction company, Hargrove & Sons, a name that, even as a little girl, I thought was telling. My grandfather, Elias Hargrove, built that company from a single truck and a handshake contract in 1974. He started in residential renovation work in central Ohio, undercutting nobody, overcharging nobody, just showing up every single day and doing what he said he'd do. By the time I was born, Hargrove & Sons had 30 full-time employees and a reputation that spread across 3 counties. By the time I was in high school, they were bidding on municipal contracts, libraries, firehouses, a county records building. Grandpa Elias was not a flashy man. He wore the same brand of work boots for 30 years. He drove a truck until it wouldn't start, but he kept meticulous records. Every receipt, every contract, every change order, every subcontractor invoice filed, dated, organized in binders that lined 2 full shelves in his home office. He used to let me sit in there when I was small. I'd pretend to read the binders while he worked at his desk. And sometimes he'd look over and say, "You know what's in those, Viv? The truth. You can argue all you want with a person, but you cannot argue with a document." I didn't fully understand what he meant until I was 28 years old and sitting across a conference table from a corporate attorney while my brother called me a liability. My parents divorced when I was 11. My father, Warren, remarried quickly. A woman named Cheryl, who had 2 kids of her own and who, within about 18 months, had rearranged our entire household dynamic in ways that felt permanent. Spencer was old enough and charming enough to attach himself to Warren's world. He played golf with our dad by the time he was 15. He interned at Hargrove & Sons at 17. He called Cheryl by her first name like they'd always been close. I was quieter. I was closer to my mother, and after the divorce I spent more time with her and with Grandpa Elias, who was my mother's father, not my father's. That's a detail that mattered later. Grandpa Elias had no blood connection to Spencer. Spencer knew it. Spencer had never particularly tried to build one. When I was in college studying accounting, Grandpa Elias started having me help him review quarterly financials for the company. Not officially, just at his kitchen table. Him reading numbers aloud and me cross-referencing against the invoices. He said he liked having a second set of eyes. He said I had a knack for catching things that didn't line up. I thought it was just a way for us to spend time together. I didn't realize he was teaching me something specific until much later. My grandfather had a heart attack at 74. He survived it, but it scared him, and in the months after, he started getting his affairs in order. He updated his will, he restructured some accounts. And he had a series of conversations with me, quiet ones, in that same home office, where he told me things I didn't fully process at the time. He said he was worried about the company after he was gone. Not about its finances, the company was solid, but about its direction. Spencer had been working there for 6 years by that point, most recently as operations manager, and Grandpa Elias didn't distrust him exactly. But he said Spencer had a habit of moving fast and looking back later. He said that worked fine in good markets. He said it got people buried in bad ones. He told me he was leaving me a 20% stake in Hargrove & Sons. He said it wasn't about giving me power. It was about giving the company a check. He said, "You're the one who reads the binders, Viv. I need someone at that table who reads the binders." He made me promise not to say anything to anyone until after he was gone and the will was read. I promised. And I kept it. Grandpa Elias passed away 14 months after his heart attack. He was 75. It was a Tuesday in November, and my mother called me at 6 in the morning, and I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time before I could stand up. The will reading was 3 weeks later at an attorney's office in Columbus. My mother was there. I was there. My uncle Terry, Grandpa's younger brother was there. My father showed up, which surprised me, though Grandpa Elias had done business with Warren for years, and I think my father considered it a professional obligation more than a personal one. Spencer came in with Cheryl, which I also hadn't expected. They sat on the same side of the table, close together, and Spencer had a legal pad and a pen, like he was there to take notes. The attorney read through the standard bequests first, specific items, cash amounts to certain relatives, a donation to the trade school where Grandpa had done his early certifications. Then he got to Hargrove and Sons. The company was to pass primarily to Spencer. 60% ownership. My Uncle Terry received 10%. My mother received 10%, which she hadn't expected and which made her press her fingers to her mouth. And then the attorney said my name and the room went very still. 20% to Vivian Hargrove, with a seat on the company's board of directors and the right to full financial disclosure on a quarterly basis. Spencer turned and looked at me. It was not a warm look. Cheryl put her hand on his arm. My father stared at the wall. Nobody said anything for a moment, and then Spencer said very quietly, "Is that a mistake?" The attorney said it was not. Spencer didn't say anything else at the will reading. He was composed in the way that people are composed when they are saving something for later. The something for later came about 6 weeks after the will was executed, when the company held its first formal board meeting since Grandpa Elias's death. It was held in the Hargrove and Sons conference room, a room I'd been in dozens of times growing up, with its wood-panelled walls and the framed photo of the original truck above the credenza. Spencer had added things since taking over. A flat-screen display on one wall, a whiteboard with projected revenue targets, a new chair at the head of the table that cost more than my first car. He sat in that chair. I sat near the middle of the table, next to my Uncle Terry, who was sweet and somewhat overwhelmed by all of it, and who kept offering me mints from his pocket. There was an outside attorney there, not the estate attorney, but a corporate one Spencer had retained. His name was Cliff, and he had the specific kind of smooth confidence that comes from charging $400 an hour. There was also a financial advisor Spencer had brought on, a man named Douglas, who had a lot of charts. The meeting started civilly enough. Spencer presented a strategic plan for the coming year. New equipment purchases, a bid on a county infrastructure project, some personnel restructuring. It sounded reasonable on the surface. I took notes. Then Spencer introduced an agenda item called ownership structure clarification, and something in my stomach tightened. He said, carefully and with obvious preparation, that he had reviewed the company's operating agreement and believed that the 20% stake bequeathed to me under the will created certain, he paused here and looked at Cliff, complications. He said the stake had been structured in a way that the prior agreement hadn't anticipated. He said Cliff had identified a possible avenue for reclassifying my shares as non-voting interest. He looked at me when he said that last part, not with anger, with the practiced calm of someone who has already decided how a conversation ends. I said, "Can you be more specific about the reclassification?" Cliff jumped in with a lot of language, passive interest, legacy transfer provisions, operational continuity. I let him finish. Then I said, "Are you arguing that the operating agreement supersedes the will?" Cliff said it was more nuanced than that. I said I'd need to review the specific clauses he was referencing and asked for the documentation before we proceeded. Spencer said, "Vivian, I think you're misunderstanding the intent here." And I said, "I'm not misunderstanding anything, I'm asking for documentation." There was a pause, the kind of pause that tells you a lot about a room. Douglas shuffled his charts, Terry ate a mint. Spencer said that perhaps we could revisit the item at the next meeting after everyone had a chance to review the materials. I said that was fine. I drove home in complete silence, and then I sat in my apartment kitchen with a yellow legal pad and I started writing everything down, every word, the exact language Cliff had used, the exact phrase Spencer had said, the agenda item title, the date, the time, every person present. My grandfather's voice in my head, "You cannot argue with the document." I called my own attorney the next morning. Her name was Priya, and I had used her once before for a lease dispute, and I trusted her. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Do you have access to the company's financials as specified in the will?" I said yes. The will had explicitly granted me full financial disclosure on a quarterly basis. She said, "Request them." I sent the formal request the next day via certified mail to the company's registered address. I kept the receipt. The documents arrived 3 weeks later, not promptly, nor organized, but they arrived. And I sat with them for 2 weekends straight, cross-referencing against public records, against the quarterly summaries Grandpa Elias had shared with me informally over the years, against the bid records I'd found in his home office files that my mother had let me go through after the funeral. What I found took me a while to understand and then a short time to be very sure about. There was a subcontractor, a concrete and foundation company called Meridian Site Services, that had been invoiced on 4 separate projects over the previous 2 years. The invoices were in order, the amounts were in the normal range. But when I cross-referenced against the county building permits and project timelines, Meridian's work dates didn't line up. On one project, they were invoiced for poor work during a 2-week window when county inspection records showed the site had been shut down for a drainage issue. On another, the invoice amount was 40% higher than the license estimate on file with the municipality. I pulled Meridian's business registration from the Ohio Secretary of State's website. It had been formed 18 months before the first invoice. The registered agent was a man named Kevin Driscoll. Kevin Driscoll was Spencer's college roommate. I sat very still for a moment. Then I pulled out a new legal pad and started from the beginning. I spent the next 6 weeks building what I thought of privately as the binder. I requested additional financial records. I was entitled to them, so I sent formal requests for each quarter going back 3 years. I documented every request, every response, every delay. I cross-referenced every Meridian invoice against public permit records, inspection logs, and third-party material cost indexes. I got a second opinion from a forensic accounting consultant named Peter, who I found through a professional referral from Priya. Peter reviewed my work and was quiet for a long time and then told me that what I'd put together was, in his professional opinion, a coherent and documented pattern of invoice fraud. The amounts weren't small. Across 4 projects, the inflated and potentially fabricated invoices totaled just under $340,000. Meanwhile, the ownership dispute was progressing on Spencer's end. Cliff filed a formal motion with the county probate court to reclassify my shares. The non-voting interest argument formally submitted. I was officially being taken to court by my own brother to strip the rights my grandfather had explicitly given me. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in March. I wore my grandfather's watch. It was the only piece of jewelry he'd ever owned, a simple Timex with a leather band, scratched and faded. My mother had given it to me after the funeral. I put it on that morning and I felt, in a way I can't entirely explain, like he was watching. Spencer arrived with Cliff and with Cheryl and with my father, who had apparently decided to support Spencer's position in whatever capacity a stepfather by proxy could occupy. They sat on one side of the courtroom. My mother sat behind me. Priya sat beside me. The judge was a woman named the Honorable Sandra Watkins. She had short grey hair and reading glasses and an expression of someone who had seen every version of this kind of dispute and was not interested in theatrics. Cliff made his opening argument. He was good at it. Organized, measured, hit the key legal points cleanly. The gist was that my grandfather had not properly accounted for the existing operating agreement when structuring my inheritance, that the will's intent could be honored in spirit through a financial distribution while protecting operational, decision-making integrity, and that a 20% minority stakeholder with board rights and quarterly disclosure requirements created structural complications for a closely held family business. It was professionally argued. It was also, I believed, wrong. And then something happened I had not anticipated. Spencer leaned over to Cliff and said something quietly, and Cliff straightened, and then Spencer himself spoke. Not as a witness, just in that informal side-channel way that sometimes happens in civil hearings before testimony is called. He said directly that his sister had no operational experience with the company, had never worked there, had been given the stake as a sentimental gesture by an elderly man at the end of his life, and that her involvement constituted not a check on the business but a disruption to it. He said I had no idea how the company actually functioned. Judge Watkins looked up from her papers. She looked at Spencer for a moment. Then she looked at me. She said, "Miss Hargrove, I understand you have a response to the petitioner's motion. Before we proceed formally, I'd like to ask you directly, what is the basis of your interest in retaining voting rights specifically?" I had prepared for this question. I had prepared for a lot of questions. But I hadn't prepared for it coming this early and this directly, and for just a second I felt the full weight of the room, my brother's expression, my father's careful neutrality, Cheryl's folded hands. I said, "Your Honor, I have a substantive basis for my interest in financial oversight of this company. Over the course of reviewing the quarterly financial disclosures I was entitled to under the will, I identified what I believed to be a pattern of fraudulent invoicing by a subcontractor with a personal relationship to the petitioner. I have documentation. I'd like to introduce it." The room went very quiet. Judge Watkins took off her reading glasses. She looked at Cliff. She said, "Counselor, were you aware of this?" Cliff said carefully that he was not. She looked at Spencer. Spencer's face had gone the particular color of someone who had made a calculation error. She said, "I'm going to need a recess." The recess lasted 40 minutes. When we came back, Cliff asked for a continuance. Judge Watkins granted a short one and made clear in her tone that she expected full cooperation with any related inquiry. She also said, and I have gone back to this moment many times since, that the petition to reclassify the shares would not be adjudicated until the underlying financial questions were resolved because, in her words, the petitioner cannot simultaneously argue that the respondent has no legitimate business interest while the respondent is presenting documentation suggesting a material breach of fiduciary duty. That was it. That was the sentence. Spencer walked out of the courtroom with Cliff close behind him. My father followed without looking at me. Cheryl looked at me once briefly and then looked away. My mother grabbed my hand in the hallway and held it for a long moment without saying anything. My Uncle Terry, who had come as a witness and spent most of the hearing eating mince in the gallery, found me outside and said, "Your grandfather knew exactly what he was doing when he put you in that room, you know." The investigation that followed was not fast, and it was not clean. The Ohio Attorney General's office got involved. There were document subpoenas and depositions and months of back and forth between attorneys. Peter's forensic accounting report became the backbone of the case. The Meridian invoices, cross-referenced against the public records I'd compiled, were central. Kevin Driscoll eventually cooperated with investigators in exchange for a reduced charge. His cooperation included detailed descriptions of how the arrangement had worked and who had initiated it. Spencer was charged with wire fraud and misappropriation of company funds. He negotiated a plea. He was not sentenced to prison, a fact that I know bothered people when it became known. And honestly, it bothered me too. He received 3 years of probation, was required to make full restitution to the company, and was removed from all leadership positions at Hargrove & Sons. He can no longer serve as an officer or director of any company involved in government contracting under the terms of his plea agreement. The probate petition to reclassify my shares was withdrawn. I still have my seat on the board. My Uncle Terry and I, between us, hold 30%. My mother holds 10%. There's a new general manager hired from outside the family, a woman named Teresa who had 20 years of construction management experience and who, the first time I met her, asked if she could see the company's financial filing system and then spent 2 hours in the records room and came out looking satisfied in a way I recognized. The company's doing fine. Better than fine, actually. The municipal infrastructure bid Spencer had been pursuing went through, and Teresa's team executed it on budget and ahead of schedule. And the county project manager wrote a letter of commendation that now hangs in the conference room next to the framed photo of the original truck. I think about my grandfather a lot. I think about those Saturday mornings in his home office, the smell of coffee and old paper, the way he'd read numbers out loud and wait for me to catch the discrepancy. I used to think he was just keeping himself sharp. I understand now that he was building something, not just in me, but for the company, for the people who worked there, for the future he couldn't entirely control but could partially shape by being careful about who he trusted with the truth. He knew Spencer. He loved Spencer. in the complicated way you can love someone you also see clearly. He didn't put me on that board to punish his grandson. He put me there because he understood that love without accountability isn't protection, it's permission. I still wear his watch sometimes. Not every day, but on the days that matter. The last time I wore it, I was sitting in the conference room for a quarterly board review, the same room, the same wood-panelled walls, the same photograph on the wall. The new chair at the head of the table was gone. Teresa sits in the same chair everyone else sits in, which I think is right. I had the financials open in front of me and a cup of coffee going cold at my elbow, and for a moment the room was quiet, and I could almost feel the weight of all those binders on the shelves in his home office, all that accumulated truth. Paper trails don't lie. He told me that before I was old enough to understand it. I understand it now. There's a version of this story where I walked out of that conference room the first day and never came back, where I told myself it wasn't worth the fight, that Spencer could have it, that I didn't need the headache. I came close to that version. I sat in my car in a parking lot for 20 minutes after that first board meeting, and I genuinely wasn't sure I had the stomach for what I could already feel was coming. What kept me wasn't anger. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect the story to be about rage, about finally fighting back, about not letting them win. But what kept me was something quieter. It was the memory of my grandfather reading numbers out loud at his kitchen table, waiting for me to catch the discrepancy. It was the way he treated accuracy like it was a form of respect, for the people who did the work, for the clients who paid for it, for the company he built with his hands. He didn't keep meticulous records because he was suspicious of everyone. He kept them because he believed the truth deserved a permanent home. That's what I kept coming back to when the work got hard, not what I stood to gain, what I owed to what he had built. I think about the choices Spencer made, and I don't spend much time on contempt. What I keep returning to is how it started. Not with one big decision to commit fraud, but with 100 small ones, a favor for a college friend, an invoice that was a little high but close enough, a project timeline that didn't quite add up but nobody was checking. And because nobody checked, because the people who should have been paying attention had been quietly edged out, it kept going. That's how these things work. They don't announce themselves. They accumulate in the space that honesty vacated. What stopped it was documentation, not confrontation, not emotion, not someone finally getting loud enough, just paper, carefully kept, against other paper, carefully kept, until the picture they made together was impossible to ignore. My grandfather understood something I had to learn the hard way, that doing right by people requires more than good intentions. It requires the discipline to build systems that outlast your good intentions, records, processes, accountability structures that function even when the people inside them aren't at their best. That's not cynicism, that's respect for human fallibility, including your own. It takes a particular kind of integrity to build a check on yourself into the structure of your own work. And it takes persistence to follow the numbers when following them is inconvenient and lonely and the people you love are on the other side of the table. I sat with those financial documents for 6 weeks. I requested records I was entitled to and waited for them and cross-referenced them and asked for help when I needed it. I didn't do it because it was easy. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and because I had been taught, in that home office, at that kitchen table, that the right thing usually reveals itself in the details, if you're willing to look. I'm still at that board table, I still bring a legal pad, I still read the binders. Some lessons you carry in your head, some you carry on your wrist,